Imagine for a moment a company you rely on. Maybe it's a major supplier, a key player in your industry, or even the small business you founded. And suddenly it hits the financial wall. When that happens, you don't just hear the news. You start hearing these really intimidating legal terms: insolvency, administration, liquidation.
Mm.
To an outsider, it just sounds like this chaotic, messy free-for-all where everyone rushes in to grab what they can. But the reality is, it's very different. Corporate failure in the modern economy isn't chaos. It's a process. It's a highly structured, almost surgical system. It's designed to either wind the business down completely or, if there's any hope, to save it. And critically, how the money gets distributed. Well, that's governed by the absolute strict letter of the law. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into the world of corporate failure, drawing on sources like the ACCA Law Review and key insolvency frameworks. Our mission is to really clearly define the mechanisms that people often confuse: administration and liquidation. And most importantly, we're going to detail that critical legal hierarchy that determines who gets paid when a company collapses. Okay, let's unpack this.
And this isn't just some dry academic law. This is fundamental business knowledge for you. If you're extending credit, or if you rely on a trading partner, or you run a business yourself, understanding these legal structures, it determines who survives, who gets paid, and frankly, who walks away with nothing. We're really looking at risk management through the lens of the law. And to start, we have to get away from this idea that corporate collapse is always about destruction. The system is actually designed to seek rescue first.
So the legal framework is designed to be, what, optimistic, at least at the start.
So precisely. When a company is facing, severe insolvency, the formal first line of defense, the mechanism specifically designed as a rescue attempt, is called administration. This is where the law really separates rescue from ruin. The primary statutory goal of administration is explicitly to try and stabilize and rescue the company, to keep it as a going concern, or failing that, to get a better result for the creditors than an immediate fire sale liquidation would.
So it's not just a fancy name for bankruptcy. It's a calculated intervention. And this is where that concept of the moratorium comes in, right? If we look at the bigger picture, administration buys you crucial time. It provides a legal shield, the moratorium, which basically protects the company from its creditors.
Yeah.
So every legal action, every demand for payment, every seizure of assets is just frozen.
That moratorium is the lifeblood of the whole process. During that pause, a licensed administrator steps in, takes complete management control from the directors, and then assesses whether the company can be restructured and made viable again. It's corporate triage.
I like that. You can think of it as rushing the business to the corporate emergency room, and the administrator is the trauma surgeon. You have to stop the financial bleeding first, and then see if the underlying business can actually survive the operation. But I have to ask, if administration buys time, doesn't it also, fundamentally disadvantage creditors? By stopping them from acting quickly, you could be allowing assets to diminish even further?
That's a really important question. It gets to the legal compromise at the heart of the structure. And yes, the moratorium absolutely restricts creditors' immediate rights, no question. But the economic thinking behind it is that this restriction maximizes the long-term collective good. If creditors were just allowed to rush in and tear the company apart, asset by asset, the total value you'd get would be far, far less than what you'd get from an organized restructure, or even just an orderly sale managed by the administrator. The law is essentially forcing cooperation for the best group outcome.
Okay, so this is genuinely about maximizing creditor value, not about protecting the original owners. So what happens if that restructuring fails? If the administrator realizes the patient just can't be saved, what's the next step?
That's when the process shifts. It moves definitively from rescue to the end state, liquidation.
And that transition means the company is finished. It ceases to exist as a separate legal entity, and its assets have to be systematically sold off or realized to generate cash, which is then distributed to everyone who is owed money.
And even within this final stage of corporate death, there are critical distinctions. And they tell you everything about the company's financial state right before the end. These distinctions are based on who started the action.
Let's start with the one that implies some degree of control, even in failure: voluntary liquidation.
Voluntary means the process is initiated internally. The decision is made by the company's owners, the members, or by the directors. And this generally splits into two types. If the company is actually solvent, meaning it can still pay all its debts but maybe just needs to close for strategic reasons, that's a member's voluntary liquidation.
A managed wrap-up, basically.
Exactly. But far more common is the creditor's voluntary liquidation. That's where the directors recognize the company is insolvent and they choose to initiate the wind down themselves. By doing that, they keep a measure of control and they can cooperate with the liquidator. It potentially lets them avoid the harsher penalties that can come with a forced closure. They're effectively waving the white flag voluntarily.
Right, so voluntary liquidation implies the insiders are still driving the car, even if it's heading off a cliff. But what happens when that control is completely lost? That's when external forces have to step in, and then it initiates the forced end, compulsory liquidation. Compulsory liquidation is often seen as the ultimate failure state. It's not the business's choice. It's initiated by a court order, almost always petitioned by an unpaid creditor. A supplier, a lender, maybe a tax authority. They decide they've waited long enough, and they ask the court to step in and forcibly close the company, just to get at the remaining assets.
And the key differentiator between the two routes is purely about agency. Who is in control? In a voluntary liquidation, the directors are being proactive, they're showing some degree of responsibility. In a compulsory liquidation, control is just stripped away. The court appoints the liquidator, usually because the directors failed to act in time, or the creditors just lost all patience. But look, whether the liquidation is a managed retreat or a forced closure, once those assets are turned into cash, the focus immediately shifts to the most critical and honestly the most contentious part of the whole process, the legal order of priority.
The order of priority. This is the rigid, non-negotiable legal structure that dictates precisely who gets paid and in what sequence. For anyone who has extended credit or is owed money, understanding where you sit in this queue is everything. It's the difference between surviving the loss and taking a complete write-off.
Absolutely. This is the law protecting certain classes of debt over others. You cannot deviate from it. Let's walk through the strict hierarchy segment by segment because the devil is entirely in the details here. At the very, very top, essentially insulated from the whole corporate failure, are the fixed charge holders. They get paid first directly from the sale of the asset they have security over.
Okay, so we need a clear example here. Let's imagine a mid-sized manufacturing company fails. Who is the fixed charge holder?
Okay, good example. Let's say that manufacturing company took out a big loan, and as security for that specific loan, they gave the bank a fixed charge. It's basically a mortgage over their main factory building and, say, a specific, very expensive CNC machine. When the company collapses, those two specific assets are sold. The bank, the fixed charge holder, is paid its debt immediately from the proceeds of those two sales. Before anyone else sees a penny from those sales, they have specific collateral.
That's a huge distinction.
It is. So once those secured assets are dealt with, the next priority, second in line, that goes to the costs of liquidation or administration.
That seems bizarre, doesn't it? Why do the trauma surgeon's bills get paid before the historic debt is settled? Why is that rule so rigid?
It's rigid because without this guarantee, the entire system would fail. The professionals, the liquidator, the lawyers, the valuers, they have to be paid with certainty. If there was no guarantee they would get their costs back, no one would agree to take on the mess of a failing company. Prioritizing the costs ensures the mechanism of failure resolution actually functions. The system has to pay its mechanics first.
That makes perfect structural sense, though it's probably cold comfort to the unsecured suppliers.
Precisely. Next, we move on to preferential creditors. Historically, this category was used to protect certain employee claims, so wages owed for the period right before the collapse, sometimes specific pension contributions. The specifics vary by jurisdiction, they're always evolving, but the core idea is to protect vulnerable individuals who can't take collateral. After preferential creditors, we hit the floating charge holders, and these are a slightly trickier form of security. Unlike the bank with the mortgage on the factory, that's a fixed charge, the floating charge holders have security over a class of assets that changes over time. Think of things like the company's entire stock of raw materials, its fluctuating inventory, or its list of debtors.
That sounds like they should be almost as protected as the fixed charge holders.
They are, but there's a vital, legally mandated compromise here. And here's where it gets really interesting for the general creditor. Before the floating charge holder gets fully paid, the law requires that a specific portion of the funds from those floating assets, it's known as the prescribed part, that has to be set aside for the very last people in the queue, the unsecured creditors.
Wait, so even though the floating charge holder has security, the law forces them to surrender some of their funds to the general pool?
Precisely. It's a small statutory percentage, it's often capped, but it serves as a kind of, well, a non-zero lifeline for unsecured creditors. It ensures they don't just walk away with absolutely nothing. It's a mechanism of social policy, really, built right into the legal structure.
Yeah.
So once that prescribed part is calculated and set aside, the floating charge holder then gets the remainder of their debt. And after that, we finally arrive at the vast majority of people who are owed money, the ones who truly have to cross their fingers, the unsecured creditors.
And this is where most people listening will fall if they're supplying goods or services. This is the largest pool. It's the ordinary trade creditors, suppliers, utility providers, general contractual partners. If you run a small business and you give 30-day payment terms without demanding any security, this is where you land, automatically.
They're at the bottom of the list. Since all the fixed debt, the costs of the process, the preferential claims, and the bulk of the floating debt are all handled first. Unsecured creditors are the ones who most often get cents on the dollar, or, more typically, nothing at all. Their claim is entirely contingent on there being a surplus after everyone else has been paid. And finally, last on the list, paid only if a true surplus remains, are the shareholders. They're the owners, the ultimate risk takers. In a genuine insolvency liquidation, a payment to shareholders is, well, it's virtually unheard of.
It paints a stark picture. The legal structure fundamentally privileges secured lenders, those who demanded specific collateral, and the professional costs of the process itself, all over the general trading partners who kept the business running day to day. So what does this all mean?
If we look at the core design of this law, the legal structure fundamentally encourages collateral. The law views secured credit as the lifeblood of large capital investments. By protecting the fixed charge holders, the system is trying to stabilize the economy. It's trying to ensure that businesses can still get funding for major assets, even in uncertain times. The message to the market is crystal clear. If you want to be certain of payment, you have to demand security.
So let's bring this back to the big picture and just summarize what we've uncovered. We started by clearly defining the two main pathways a financially troubled company can take.
Right. We established that administration is the formal rescue attempt. It's designed to shield the company temporarily with a moratorium, to facilitate a restructuring, and maximize collective creditor value. It's the triage phase. It's aiming for survival.
And we contrasted that sharply with liquidation, which is the definitive end state where the company is wound down. We highlighted that critical difference between voluntary liquidation, where the insiders start the process, and compulsory liquidation, which is the forced closure driven by a creditor and a court.
And most critically, we detailed that strict order of priority. We emphasized how the law carefully separates the secured debt from the unsecured, placing fixed charge holders and the cost of the process at the very top, and pushing the ordinary trade suppliers to the very bottom.
It means that understanding corporate failure isn't just about reading the news headlines about a big company closing down. It's about understanding the rigid, immutable legal rules that determine who gets the remaining money and who shoulders the loss.
Absolutely. And here's a final thought for you to consider. This priority list. It forces everyone to be a lawyer, not just a business person. Your decision to extend credit isn't just about trust in a partner anymore. It's about reading the law. Because the legal mechanisms of failure actively encourage secured transactions, how does that knowledge affect the pricing of unsecured goods? If you know you are last in line, do you charge a higher price up front to compensate for that increased risk? The legal architecture subtly shapes every single commercial transaction far beyond the courtroom.